Hello. Hello and welcome to the Archives History Library. Before we get started with this evening's block speaker, I would like to mention some upcoming events. In July, we have 3 lectures scheduled. On July 12th, Joe Wyatt will speak on his new book, Quagmire in Babylon, A History of the Iraq War, 1998 to 2018. Dr. Wyatt will discuss the events leading to the U.S. invasion of Iraq, the push to Baghdad, and the outcomes of these events. Excuse me. On July 19th, Kyle Warmick will present Vanishing Act, Rediscovering the South Charleston Naval Ordnance Plant. Kyle will discuss the origins and development of the plant and his efforts to create the South Charleston Interpretive Center's upcoming Ordnance Plant exhibit this fall. Anthony, would you like to come up and speak? Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. And I want to thank you all for coming. And on behalf of the nonprofit organization, West Virginia Center for African American Art and Culture, we want to thank Mr. Edward Hargro. His wife, Gloria, is in the audience, and her sister, who's with us as well. And you, the audience, I want to thank you for coming also. West Virginia Center for African American Art and Culture have been putting on this block speaker series since 2014. 4 speakers for the summer. This is our annual block speaker series program. We'd like for you to spread the word for our next guest, who will be Sim Fryson. Very outstanding businessman in the neighborhood of South Charleston and Ashland, Kentucky. And he has a very, very outstanding life that he wants to share with us. He'll be here the last Thursday of July at 6 o'clock p.m. We have our book that we have been selling called The Black Past, which details the African American history of Charleston and the Knoll Valley, that you can get a copy of it by making a phone call to myself, any of my board members. One of them are here tonight, Ms. Chlorine Carter, and anyone on the website if you were to visit us at cacwv.org. Without any delay, I'd like to introduce our guest for the night, Mr. Edward Hargro, who will share with you his life as being the son of a Tuskegee Airman. And during the course of the evening, you can take a look at the 2 exhibits that we have here, the books on the table as well, and enjoy what Mr. Hargro has to say. Thank you very much. Sir.
Thank you very much for attending this show and dance. I put this cap on briefly just to let you know that these were the unit patches that the Tuskegee Airmen had. With the units that they had 4 fighter units, pursuit squadrons who flew P-40 and P51 Mustang airplanes, and they had 4 bomber units which flew B-25 Mitchells, and the 4 bomber units were never deployed into combat. And the initial story on the Tuskegee Airmen is the fact that before I get there, I have a passion for this because my dad was a Tuskegee Airman. And when I was a child, on winter days, we would ask my dad to take this book, which was the original book that has the pictures in it from the first few classes and the people who were the personnel in the Tuskegee Experiment. And we would ask him, he said, "Daddy, tell us what you did in the Army." And he would pull his book out and he would start telling us what he did in the Army. My wife, Gloria Hargro, and her sister, they have a passionate tie to the Tuskegee Airmen also. Their uncle, Bud Wade, was the chief mechanic and master sergeant of over all the mechanics in Tuskegee at one time. Benjamin O. Davis Jr., who was the commander, He was his personal mechanic and kept his airplane running. Right, 1914, 1918, World War I raged, and a new introduction to the battlefield was the airplane. And this changed the face of the battlefield forever. Soldiers had to stand up and engage each other and run recon missions and find out if who's over in Huntington, because we're going to go that way tomorrow on foot, and how many are there, and so forth and so on. Now with the airplane, you could go out in a recon and you could fly over and almost do a head count and come back and tell exactly where they are, what direction they're coming in, and how to get ready for it. Because the worst thing in combat is to run into something and not know what it is. It's usually called an ambush, and people don't live through too many of them. So you got to study the enemy, and the best way to study the enemy now was with the airplane. So after World War I, 1914, 1918, the plane slowly started to evolve. It was in its infant stages in 1914, 18. They had biplanes. They would drop in a suitcase full of black powder out with a fuse in it, and you tried to make sure the fuse didn't go off before you got it out of the fuselage, because if it did, one of you had to get out. And they didn't have guns strapped on. They had shotguns. The tail gunner had a shotgun, a rifle, and pistol. But between 1918 and 1939, the plane evolved into a sophisticated fighting machine. And at that time, they had the United States Army Air Corps, had the P-40 Warhawk and the P-47 Thunderbolt. And those were two very good airplanes. But there was a problem. Black soldiers tried to get into the Army Air Corps, and they were turned away at the door. And the reason they were turned away, in 1925, there was an Army War College study. Now, in a study, there were people, but we don't know anything about the people in the study. We just know after it was declassified, the study said, due to the inferior intelligence of the Negro soldier, he is incapable of learning how to fly an airplane. He lacks moral courage. He does not have reflexes, and he does not have the physical courage to engage an enemy in actual combat. So Negro soldiers would go and they would apply to the Army Air Corps flight schools, and they would pull the document. Here's what it says. You know, it's true. So finally, the NAACP, Pittsburgh Courier newspaper, Chicago newspaper, LA black newspaper, started to put political pressure on the powers that be in Washington, D.C. to see if they could get an experiment started. You say we can't do it, just give us a chance to try it. The Civil Air Patrol at West Virginia State College, Tuskegee, Howard University, and Hampton had already started training black pilots, but they still would not let them in the military. George Spanky Roberts, the gentleman from Fairmont, he graduated from West Virginia State College, and when he went to try to get in the military, U.S. Army Air Corps flight school, they would not let him in. Same story. This 1925 Army War College study says that you can't come in. In 1936, Benjamin O. Davis Jr. finished West Point, a black man, number 30th out of a class of 275 cadets. He went and applied for the Army Aviation School. They pulled out that 1925 study again. Here's what it says. He says the Army says that if you finish West Point in the top 25% of your class, you can get in any branch of the service and do anything you want to. They said, oh, we didn't know anything about that. They said, well, we have to give you a physical exam. So they gave him a physical exam. And 1 hour later, they came back and told him he was an epileptic. And as an epileptic, we can't let you fly airplanes, of course. So in 1939, succumbing to pressure from various black organizations, NAACP, newspapers, other black organizations, President Roosevelt signed Public Law 18, which is like an executive order. And as such, starting in 1941, they were going to start the Tuskegee Experiment. Actually, it was going to start at West Virginia State College because West Virginia State College had a Civil Air Patrol. The reason it was never put at West Virginia State College is because the Chemical Valley was down there, nitro was down there, nitroglycerin in tanks. You don't want a plane to go errant and dive and hit one of those tanks. So they decided, for safety reasons, to take it to Tuskegee, and that's where the experiment started. Started in 1941. It was a self-contained city formed with 300 enlisted men and officers. It had 33 pilots and 27 airplanes. By self-contained, they had cooks and bakers and parachute riggers and weathermen and mechanics, and they had their own Army Air Band. And they had the PX, so you didn't have to go off base to get anything. Everything was contained right there for you. The commander of the unit was a white gentleman by the name of Knoll Parrish. And this white gentleman was a guy from Kentucky. And my dad told me, a more honest man God never made. And he was responsible for keeping this thing together. And whenever a mistake was made, he was called into D.C. Congress and senators would grill him. And when they finished with him, he looked like he had been beaten with a cat o' nine tails. And they told him, they said, this experiment, you're wasting taxpayers' money. This thing will never make it. Why don't you stop it? You can do it with a stroke of a pen. And there were many congressmen and senators that stayed on him. And not only did he have to go to D.C., they would impromptu come over and take a look at things. And they just wanted to find something wrong so they could stop the program. But the program went on, and it went on. And my dad would tell me stories about how Knoll Parrish would come out and he would encourage the blacks, any of the blacks who were on the base, he would encourage them, you're doing a good job, just keep doing what you're doing. In the first class, and you can see by this picture over here, in the first class, 13 cadets started, 5 finished. Out of the 5 that finished, one was from Fairmont. His name was George Spanky Roberts. He became one of the most highly decorated pilots in the Air Force, period, in any war. He flew a P51 in World War II, an F-83 Sabre in Korea, and an F-4 Phantom in Vietnam. He flew close to 300 missions, and he was their first commander of the 99th. In 1949, when President Harry S. Truman, integrated the services, he became the first black to command an integrated unit at Langley Air Force Base in Langley, Virginia, and was highly decorated for that. He had over 6,000 hours in the cockpit without ever going down. What a feat. What a feat indeed. Like I say, they started in 1941. Into 1942 and 1943, they had started to graduate the first few classes. Now, when they were putting together the Tuskegee Experiment, they had to put the feelers out because you had to have doctors, they had dentists, they had weathermen, they had pharmacists, pharmacy techs, they had one surgeon. These were all professional people. So the first thing that they said was, this is not going to make it because we're going to put out feelers for doctors. Where are we going to find black doctors? Ha ha ha. And so they put the feelers out, and all of a sudden, black doctors started showing up. Black nurses started showing up, RNs, LPNs. Pharmacists started showing up. And like I say, they had one surgeon. And so this group was put together, this self-contained city, which was training brand new pilots, was put together, and it was off and running. They would make sure that everything was done exactly right, and I'm sure that if we had a chance to talk to Gloria and Janet's uncle, Master Sergeant Bud Wade, the mechanics took pride in making sure that these planes did not go down because of mechanical failure. And they did everything by the book. Everything. If a torque wrench said 9 PSI, you looked and it was 9. Not 8.5 or 9.5, but 9. And that's the way they operated. Because when a plane goes down, they are able to bring it back, take a look at it, and say, look, whose was the mechanic that day? Well, he was sloppy, and this is the reason it went down. The mechanics knew that if a plane went down, they were as guilty as anybody else, because they were the ones who were taking care of it. These pilots took such pride in their planes that they would tell these mechanics took such great pride in their planes, they would tell the pilots, now this is my airplane. You are allowed to fly it, and you take good care of it. And when you go into combat, you make sure you bring it home the way I gave it to you. And these, they took great pride in it. That was the, I call it the infamous P51. That was the plane when they first started flying. After the pilots were trained at Tuskegee, they were given the worst of the worst, because they were all black pilots. There were 2 phases of training. There was the primary phase. The washout rate in the primary phase was about 60%. And I had the chance to meet 2 pilots. One was named Eugene Mayfield. He's from Shenton. And I had the chance to meet a friend of ours in Pittsburgh named Charlie Tate. And he was one of the pilots who flew 125 missions. You were only supposed to fly 65 to 70 missions and come home. What happened, they did not have anything for the black pilots to do, so they just kept them over there. And no matter how good you are, you keep going up every day, and your number is going to come up sooner or later. Tate would tell me some days, he said, it wasn't a bullet with my name on it that I feared. It was the one that said, to whom it may concern. And he said that always scared him. And that was the P51 Mustang. Built by North American Aviation. It was developed in 170 days by a British and American engineer. And it was the king of the skies. Fly about 480 miles an hour. It was the plane that helped save the bombing units that were going from the UK into Berlin to bomb Hitler into submission. And this is what the black pilots eventually got, and they got the brand new ones after they were developed. And the unit was at that time, the unit after it was fully trained was taken, the 99th and the 100 Pursuit Squadron was taken to Ramitelli, Italy. It was a segregated outfit in Ramitelli. But this is what they flew out of that group and out of Ramitelli, Italy. Plane capable of flying 490 miles an hour, 488, 90 miles an hour. They retrofitted a fuel tank right behind the seat because they had a space about that long and they didn't know what to do with it. So they retrofitted the gas tank back there. I guess it was a good idea, but I wouldn't want a gas tank right behind. And they had 2 auxiliary teardrop tanks on them, which held 65 gallons of fuel per. When the Tuskegee Airmen first started to escort the Allied bombers from the UK into Berlin, Germany, before they started, they were losing 50% of the Allied bombers. When you lose 50%, the morale is extremely low. It can't be anything but you're going to go out and I'm going to go out in one plane, you're going to go out in another plane. Who's going to come back? Because only one of us is coming back. And as they knew that from the officers club, the guys, I can imagine them walking like a death march getting into your airplane that day. The Tuskegee Airmen, when they first sent them to Ramitelli, they were relegated to menial tasks. They were strafing airfields, strafing ammo dumps, running down supply lines from railroads and trucks, and doing a recon. And even while they were doing those tasks, they were often maligned by the upper grade commanders. Some of the generals said, why are they here? They can't do anything more than they're doing now. But in talking to Charlie Tate, Captain Tate is what I called him. I would take him to a bar in Pittsburgh and I'd get him a drink and I'd say, start talking, Charlie. And he would talk and I would sit and listen like a little kid just listening. You know, I wouldn't say a word, I'd ask questions. And he said that what would happen was, while they were giving them the menial task, they were improving their flying skills. He said you had to go in, you had to hit a railroad, and he said some of the railroad cars would have guns on them because they knew they were coming after. So you had to learn how to maneuver and so forth and so on. So he said after a while, the bombers that were going in, they were losing so many, they said, look, come on, let's ask these guys to come over. You know, can't hurt anything. So with George Spanky Roberts as the commander, they decided to escort him into Berlin. Coming from a segregated air base, you had to meet over Belgium, and they would meet over Belgium and then hook up. And on each side, you would have the red tails. That's what they were called. They were called red tail angels. Some of them called them red tail devils. But it was the 99th and 100 Pursuit Squadron. I asked Tate, I said, what was your reason for success? What happened that you were found out to be successful? Discipline. I said, how so? He said, we had guys who were really good. Lee Elder, Wendell Pruitt, a couple other names that come out, C.D. Lester. He said that they were cowboys. And what I mean by a cowboy, a guy wants to get out and get in a gunfight. The minute he gets out, he wants to reach for his gun. By that I mean, when you see you're on the escort, they did not have radar at the time. So you have to look out and use your eyesight to find the enemy coming. And the way they would do it, they would say, they would look out and see dots and they would say, okay, bogey's at 2 o'clock, bogey's. So everybody looks at 2 o'clock and you can see the dots starting to get larger. Well, a cowboy wants to go out there and meet those guys. And if he goes out to meet them, he leaves a gap where he's supposed to be protecting the bombing group. And they said, don't go out there. Make them come to us and fight them 3/4 of a mile to 1.5 miles out so that you don't leave gaps open. And he said that's exactly what they did. So he said they started making their first runs. And they were making their first runs, and he said they were doing all right. One day they went over, and they took 75 planes over, and they brought 75 back. And he said, the word gets around quickly. Benjamin O. Davis, who was the commander, said, we're no longer being assigned. And he looked at the group, and the group thought that they meant no longer being assigned. They send us back. He said, no, we're being requested. Because everybody wanted to come home, of course. So that was the plane that they used to go into, escort them into Berlin. and get them back home safely. This was a picture that was taken. It hangs in the Smithsonian Institute. It hangs in my little cubby hole. I call it my office. I don't know what Gloria calls it. But it hangs in there. That's a P51 Mustang. The pilot in it, C.D. Lester, he was one of the cowboys I was telling you about. He had the potential to be a cowboy because they said his reflexes, the things that they said the U.S. Army War College said they didn't have, they said his reflexes were unbelievable. If you look up to the left, you see an ME-109. This was the second day up with the P-51, and he had shot down 2 ME-109s. The wingman took the picture because each P-51 Mustang had 3 machine guns in each wing, 50 caliber, and it had a little camera. And that camera was for 2 reasons. When you get into combat, you want to see what the enemy's doing. So you use your camera to take pictures while to watch him scramble and do the other maneuvers that he's doing. And the other reason is because the pilot would come back and they say, how many planes did you shoot down today? Oh, I must have shot down 15. So they'd pull the film, and the film would tell us exactly how many they had shot down. The name of that picture is 2 down, 1 to go, because he shot 3 planes down that day. And that hangs in the Smithsonian, and it hangs in my Smithsonian. So it's a beautiful picture. By the way, Charlie Tate, the gentleman in Pittsburgh, his C.D. Lester was his wingman for, he said, about a week. And he said he was an exceptional flyer. That is one of the gentlemen who started out with the Tuskegee Airmen. That's General David Chappie James. He was a member of the Civilian Air Patrol at Tuskegee. Tate told me he went in as a civilian instructor, and he said all he did was talk smack all day long. Just, I can do that. I can fly an airplane upside down. I can fly it backwards. I can do anything that an airplane can do. I can do it, and I can do it better than anybody. And the white commanders, every once in a while, they would challenge him. And the way they challenged him, they said, strap your chute on, we're going up. He gets in front, and you have to do everything he does. And this white commander had a maneuver where you go in, you have to follow him. You go in, and he goes in like he's going to make a turn and go into the ground and flip it. Well, at the last minute, he flips it back up. Well, every time he'd flip it back up, he looked, and Chappie James was right there on his wing. And when he got back to the officers club, he said, Chappie James is a good flyer. He said, but if he keep his mouth shut for just a minute or two. He said, he's a good pilot. Chappie James ended up, and one day Tate told me he got a brown envelope. And he said, he was a civilian pilot. He was not in the military. He got a brown envelope, and they said, open the envelope, James. Chappie opened the envelope, and they had drafted him. So now he had to come in. He stayed an instructor for a while, and then they put him in the 99th and sent him over. He fought in World War II. He fought in Korea, F-83s. He fought F-4 Phantom jets in Vietnam. He became the first 4-star general in any branch of the service, the first black 4-star general in any branch of the service. He eventually became NORAD commander. As NORAD commander, he was one of the few people who was allowed to fire a nuke over the Atlantic or the Pacific Ocean in defense of North America. That's quite a responsibility for a guy who starts out coming from Civil Air Patrol. David Chappie James. That's another picture of the Mustang. This Mustang was responsible for winning the war because it did help the Allied bombers get into Germany. And they said once they started going over with 75 to 100 bombers in line and coming back with almost all of them, then Hitler's field marshal, who was in charge of the Luftwaffe, made a statement. He said, "We're losing this war," because he was seeing P-51s over top of Berlin, and before that they weren't able to get that close. Always put a picture of Eleanor Roosevelt. When the congressmen and senators were trying to take the program down, as they kept telling them that this is not worth it, we're wasting taxpayers' money, we just can't do this, she went down and went to the training course, and she said, "Which one of you guys are pilots?" And she pointed at he said, "You a pilot?" He said, Yes ma'am, I'm a pilot." She said, "Take me for a ride." She had a dress on. She had to climb up the ladder with the dress on, got into the plane. He took her for a ride and took her for a barrel roll. And she came back, and she went back to Washington, D.C., and she told her husband, she said, "Those boys can fly." She said, "Keep that program going." And they did. That is part of the first class. That's the first class that finished. Benjamin Monroe Davis in the right near the center. George Spanky Roberts on the right, and that's Colonel Knoll Parrish, the white gentleman there, who was a son of a Kentucky Presbyterian minister, and like my dad said, a more honest man he's never met. They had interviewed some people who had retired, and this was about, I heard the interviews about 25 years ago on one of the channels on, and Knoll Parrish ended up being a one-star general. And these guys spoke so highly of him. They were retired colonels. One of them was a one-star general, and on and on and on. They said if it hadn't been for the fact that he stood up for the blacks and made sure that the Tuskegee Experiment came to fruition, he was good enough and smart enough to be a four-star general. And I heard more than one guy say that. They said he would have made 4 stars, but they said the military didn't like what he was doing, especially people who were trying to take it down. That is, I wish I knew. That's one of the planes that was on the pictures that Gloria took for me upstairs. That's a P-51. That's Uncle Bud. That's Gloria and Janice's uncle. Like I say, he's if you can see his rank, he's a master sergeant. And he was in charge of the mechanics at Tuskegee. And that's quite an honor to be given. It's quite a responsibility to be in charge of all the mechanics. And he was responsible for keeping the morale up. And like I say, my dad would tell me, my dad said, those mechanics took such great pride in making sure that that plane never went down because of a mechanical problem. And like I say, Uncle Bud was responsible for that. And he was also General Benjamin O. Davis Jr., private mechanic. I've heard that people said B.O. Davis would have a problem with his plane. The first thing he'd say is get Sergeant Wade, because he didn't want anybody else working on his airplane. That's him right there, Sergeant Wade. That's my dad. He went in 1941. He came out in 1940, either 45, late 45 or early 46. He grew up in Bozo, West Virginia. I don't know if you know what that is or not. It's down between Hinton and Princeton. It's down there on the New River. He grew up down there, and he and his uncle, and he and my uncle, his brother was drafted first. and his brother was drafted, and my dad said they were farmers, basically. And my Uncle Ron, was working around the farm, and all of a sudden a MP car came down, and it asked, "Is there a Ronald Harborough down here?" And they said, "Yes, it's Ronald Harborough." He said, "What you want with me?" They said, "You was drafted last month, so you get in the car and let's go." He went to combat. He became a driver for the Red Ball Express. He was in combat 27 months, and he never got wounded. He lost some trucks, but he never got wounded. And he won the Silver Star. He won Purple Heart and the Army Commendation Medal. Now, that's my uncle. My dad never did go overseas. He stayed around the United States, because at that time, I don't think two members of the same family was allowed to go overseas at the same time. I think that was the way it was then. It's my dad on one of the pictures on the right. Glory took that out of this book, which was the first book of all the pilots and personnel that were at Tuskegee. And when I say Tuskegee heroes, I mean a cook was a hero, a mechanic was a hero, a parachute rigger was a hero, a doctor, a nurse, a dentist, a dental tech. They were all heroes, because without one, you couldn't. This program never would have been able to come to what it was and what it came to be. That's Bud Wade in the middle. And like I say, he was a mechanic, second to none. And I never did check to see, no, yes I did. He got the Silver Star. And the Silver Star was given to him by Benjamin O. Davis Jr. He did get it in 1944 or 45. Something else, I don't know exactly what that was. That looks like me. I guess it is. That was a presentation given at Rollsburg on Armed Forces Day a couple years ago, and it's an interesting presentation in that many of the other presentations that were given, the guys actually wore the uniforms. Like a guy was giving a presentation on a World War II First Cav. He had a World War II First Cav uniform. I don't know where they got them from, but they had them on. And it was a very interesting day. Uncle Bud again, he's everywhere. Now see the gentleman on the left, that's Benjamin O. Davis Jr. Here, that's Benjamin O. Davis Jr. There's Uncle Bud. And like I say, Benjamin O. Davis Jr. was an epileptic until the Tuskegee Experiment started. So that's the end of the slideshow. In Tuskegee, 1,000 pilots were trained between 1941 and 1945. They flew a total of 15,000 sorties using the P-40s and the P-51s. A sortie is just when you go up, whether you engage in the enemy or not. If you take your plane up and you may be doing a recon, that's called a sortie. Out of the number of actual combat engagements, there were 1,500. The 99th and 100th Pursuit Squadron took down 111 planes in combat. They destroyed 150 more that were on the ground at runways. They escorted B-17s and B-24s. They were awarded 96 Distinguished Flying Medals. They were awarded in the Flying Crosses and 700 other medals with oak leaf clusters. 66 died in combat, 32 became POWs. And the interesting thing about the POWs, once POWs were turned loose, they said that they were treated better in a POW camp than many of them were treated in their hometowns. And that's a sad story. They were fighting a war on both fronts. They were fighting Jim Crow in this country, and they were fighting the Nazis over Germany. I talked to Tate, and I had some stories from Tate, and I asked him, I said, Tate, what does it feel like when you first encounter an enemy in actual combat? He said, well, basically, you're just scared as hell, is the way he put it. And he said, the first time I went up, he said, your adrenaline starts to flow. He said, if you don't lock up with panic, your adrenaline starts to flow. And he said, where your reflexes were fairly quick, he said, now they're quick, super quick. He said, where you could look out in the sky and see a bogey at 3 or 4 miles, he said, you can look out there and see one 7 or 8 miles now. And he said the one time he got in his first firefight, he said he heard something knocking in the cockpit. And I said, what was it? He says, my knees. He said, every emotion, when you get in a firefight, he said, every emotion known to mankind comes right after the other. Love, hate, compassion, all that. He said, just back and forth and back and forth. And he says, then you start to get your plane under control and you start to fight. And he said, fight you do, because you don't know if you go into the officers club tonight to have a drink. But you don't want that guy in that plane that's circling you to have a drink either. So one of you is going to have to go down. And he said that's when you really start to fight and fight hard. He said the other thing that's kind of scary is when you're out there, a machine gun, every 5th round is a tracer. And it's a white round. It burns white with white phosphorus. So you don't have to look through the reticle to see where bullet's going. You can follow it. So you can see where it's going. You can aim your plane and aim your gun with by just following that white phosphorus round. But on the other side, there is a machine gunner, and the bullets are coming your way. So here you see the white bullet. But every 5th round is a tracer. So Charlie Tate said the thing that would always bother him, he said, I see that tracer, and I can just about maneuver. He said, where are those other 4? Yeah. So, because I can't see those. And he said that was always the scary part. After they came back home, they were not given a hero's welcome when they got back home. They were just kind of, some of the black newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier had articles on them and so forth and so on. There's a photographer named, was with the Johnson Publishing Company. I'll think of his name in a second. And he was a big-time photographer. And they had gotten together, Gordon Parks, yeah. They had gotten together and they were going to send, he was considered the best black photographer around at that time, and they were going to send him to do a pictorial history of the Tuskegee Airmen while they were in Europe. Congressmen and senators out of D.C. said, no, we don't want anybody to know that there was a black fighter unit in Europe. And because they were successful, we surely don't want them to know about it now. So it wasn't until after the war that they started to put the history together, that they put the history together and made it historically correct and started making films, of which the Tuskegee Airmen HBO special was made, and then there was another one, and then George Lucas made the one a few years ago called Red Tails. And from what I understand, it was about as historically correct as it gets. You know, you always going to have some things in there that may not have happened, but it was a historically correct film. So adversity, triumph over adversity is what this story tells. You tell a guy he cannot do something, give him a chance to do it. And because they were, quotes, Negro soldiers, you don't have the intellect, you don't have the reflexes, you don't have the moral character, you don't have the intellect. But let me tell you what happened in 1949. In 1949, right before Truman decided to integrate the military, there was a Top Gun competition held at the Las Vegas airport. And the Top Gun competition had 12 squadrons. Each squadron had 4 pilots, and each pilot had his own airplane. There was a possible 4,000 points that each squadron could get in this competition. 4 pilots from the Tuskegee Airmen came into the competition, and out of the 12 squadrons, they came in number 1. Now, what happened to the reflexes between the time? And they had to have 4 targets. There were 4,000 points that you could possibly get. 4 targets. 1 on a helium-held balloon that was moving. 1 on a balloon that was stationary. They were all in the air. 1 on the ground that was on a rail that was moving. And 1 on the ground that was stationary. And out of 4,000 points, they were able to amass 3,700 points. If you go down the roster right now and you look to see who won the Top Gun competition in 1949, data not available. Data not available. Through it all, one of the greatest legacies of any group of pilots was given to the Tuskegee Airmen. And when I say Tuskegee Airmen, I mean all of them. Questions?
I got a couple for you. What was the significance of the red tail that they actually took them from? I think they trained with the red tail on them too, and then took them overseas, and they became the red tail.
Each squadron had different markings on it, and somebody in there said that the marking that they wanted on there, they wanted a red nose cone and a red tail. And that's what they did. They painted them all red.
Nothing more than that? And someone's wanted it?
Yeah, red tails.
Okay, second question. They were all taken as commissioned officers, weren't they?
Yeah, when you went into...
They had to be commissioned?
When you went into school as a cadet, you really didn't have a rank. When you finished your primary course, you still didn't have a rank. When you finished the advanced course, which means that you had finished the course and you were going to get your wings, that day you became a second lieutenant. Now, some people were already officers when they went in. Like Benjamin O. Davis, by the time he went in, he was a captain. So when he finished, he was automatically a captain, so he stayed a captain until he was assigned to the next rank or promoted to the next rank.
So what did it take to become an ace?
Five is an ace.
Do we have any?
Yes. Lee Elder was an ace. I think Wendell Pruitt was an ace. C.D. Lester, although he shot down his 3 in one day, I don't think he became an ace. But they said if you'd turned those cowboys loose and let them go out there like they wanted to go, you probably would have had a lot of aces. but they wouldn't turn them loose. The gentleman that I met from Eugene Mayfield, who was from Shenton, he's a graduate of Bluefield State, he told me exactly the same thing when I asked him. I said, what did you do that gave you that other groups weren't doing, that you were saving airplanes? He said, the discipline of staying close. And he said, Benjamin O. Davis said he dared to see a cowboy out there in the skies fighting by himself. Stay close. Yes.
Did they have an earlier version to the P51D in combat?
Yes. The earlier version was the P51, I think it's P51 Si, and it had a canopy that came down, but you couldn't see out of the back. The P51D, they started to retrofit them so that the canopy was put down so that you could see out of the back. And that was a big change. And the pilots, they had been asking for it for a long time. And you know how the bureaucratic red tape you have to go through to get something changed in the military. But it was a better plane for that reason.
Yes. Did they get the Ds before they were assigned to bomber escort, or did they use the Cs?
They got the Cs first.
Yeah, but had they already gotten the Ds by the time they went to bomber escort?
Yeah, by that time they had, because they didn't go into bomber escort at first. They kept them there for a while, and like I say, they were still being maligned by the political powers in D.C. were still maligning them, and even some of the commanders that were in Europe were still saying they can't do it. You can't do it. They can fly the airplanes. They've learned how to fly the airplanes, but you really can't trust them in combat, because they're going to turn tail and run. They've already told them that. You don't have the physical courage to engage an enemy in actual combat, so you get him up in the skies, and you're going to waste the taxpayers' money. But they found out that they had a different kind of mad dog up there.
Wasn't the engine didn't they get the engine from England? Weren't they Rolls-Royce engines? That's why they made them they were so fast?
A Rolls-Royce Merlin.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
They gave a contract to Packard to build them in this country, but it was a Rolls Merlin engine.
Right.
V12, 1950 horsepower, and then they retrofitted it with a turbocharger, and it took the speed up over 500 miles an hour. Here's something else that you won't believe. Guess what they used to increase the speed in a dogfight?
Water injection.
Exactly, water and methanol. Say, water and methanol? Why can't we do that today with Yes.
You know, our military today is all volunteer and has been for some time. And it's kind of difficult to conceive today of what circumstances there would be and which the draft would be reinstated. You know, it's always been kind of a debate about your constitutional rights. But back in the day, I asked myself two questions. One would be, you know, how critical is it for you to win this war to deny a man his right to volunteer to serve? That's just kind of mind-blowing. But then the other question is, why would that man volunteer in the first place? You know, so I mean, we're not in those two situations. So it's all we can do is speculate.
But at that time, it was a different time. They saw this fascist on his way to trying to take over, and he had mentioned that he was trying to take over the world. He just wasn't trying to take over Europe. He was trying to take over the world. So people were volunteering that had never thought of volunteering before, because they said, we don't think we want to be run by Adolf Hitler. And Hitler gave the world a run for its money, believe me. And I talked to Tate, who said that he said, now you talking about fear and panic. He said, when you looked out in the skies and you saw the dots, you would see them coming and they would get larger. And you knew that they were coming about 400 miles an hour, 350, 400. But he said, when you look out and you see the dots coming, and all of a sudden they are large, large. He said, you think, what the hell is running out there now? And he said, the wingman said, they don't have propellers, but they knew that the Germans had jets. They had never encountered them before. George Spanky Roberts was in the first group that encountered the German jets, and they didn't know what to expect. The fight was over in 10 minutes, and the German jets went home. What they found out was that the slower airplane, there's a technique where the slower airplane takes the circle inside, and the faster airplane can't get inside, so he has to be outside that circle. So he said, you don't shoot at the airplane. You put flak out at 3, 6, 9, and 12. You let him duck it. And if he's coming at you, you do the same thing. And you confine him to a hole, because there's flak out here, there's flak out here, there's flak up and down. So now you got him in a hole, because he knows if he tries to go left or right, he's going to hit something. So once you get him in that hole, say bye-bye, birdie.
After the brass kind of recognized the success of these missions over Europe, did they ever consider using Tuskegee Airmen in the Pacific Theater, or was there like a similar unit over there?
Well, the war was so close to being over that they were still in Europe at that time. The 477 Bombardment Group, which was the bombers that were being trained and had been trained, they were going to send them over to the Pacific. But the segregationist commander would not allow them to go. He said they'll just screw it up. But these were, like I say, when you first started the Tuskegee Airmen, the first three classes, they all had to have college degrees. After that, you had to have a 2-year degree. Out of the first groups that came through, I think it was, as history, you can correct me, but I think there was either 3 or 4 pilots within the first 2 or 3 classes that made a maximum score on the entrance exam, and they forced them to take it over again. Says you got to take this over, and put a monitor right over top of your head, and don't you reach for your pocket, I'll shoot you. So that's what was going on. But when you think about, you said that due to the lack of intelligence of the Negro soldier, he's incapable of learning how to fly an airplane. In a B-25, you have to have a pilot, a co-pilot, an engineer, a bombardier, and a navigator. And you don't hire stupid people to be navigators and bombardiers and pilots and co-pilots and engineers. And these were all the people that were in these, and they had 40 airplanes.
Do you think that if you did not have a self-contained city for the training of the airmen, would they have been successful?
I personally think that there would have been some who would have been successful, but I also think that the washout rate would have been higher, because out of the group of cadre or pilots who train, they had, I think it was 20 trainers or cadre pilots who were training. And they were washing out at Tuskegee, they were washing out 60%. So that's a pretty high washout rate.
I was thinking more of in Alabama during that time of frame in history, it would not have been conducive for the pilots to really maintain their structure and keep their minds on what they're doing because of the segregation going on at that time.
Well, you're talking about the pilots who had finished out of Tuskegee?
Well, I'm thinking about just the atmosphere of actually training the people. So if by you putting them all into a single place where you did not have the outside interference, they had a chance to excel better in what they were trying to do.
I would agree with you 100%. Now, the only time that they had outside influence is my dad and his buddies. On weekends, they had the Army band. And the band was broken up into a blues band and a jazz band, and they had the nurses and they had the females that come in from out of town. Well, that wasn't good enough for them. They had to go out in town. Well, if you didn't come back Monday morning at 6 o'clock for roll call, you were AWOL. And if you were AWOL, they would put you in the brig for a day. And my dad told me that when they were in Biloxi, Mississippi, there was a swamp right outside the base. Now, the Biloxi was a segregated air base also, which housed the Tuskegee Airmen, they were still called. But he said one Saturday night, they had been out partying all weekend. He said the uniforms were dirty and that, and they had to get over a fence. And so he said, here are 4 or 5 soldiers trying to get over this fence, and they got one piece of concertina wire running across the top. Because they wanted people in, they wanted to keep them in, the people out, they wanted to keep them out. And he said, he came back, and he said that your hands are bleeding, and he said he thought to himself, was that worth it? For me to go out there and have to, and he said, I wasn't AWOL the next morning, but he said, I looked like hell because he said he still had the mud on him from where they had been out in that swamp. And he said all that, and he said everything you wanted was right there on the base because it was totally self-contained. There were 5 fighter squadrons, 99th, 100th, 332nd, 301st, and 302nd. The 4 bomber squadrons who never were deployed in combat was the 616th, 617th, 618th, and 619th. Just wanted to read something here for you. This 1925 War Department, they had somebody in there that just didn't like. I'm going to say colored people. In past wars, the Negro has made a fair laborer, but an inferior technician. As a fighter, he has been inferior to the white man, even when led by white officers. The Negro officer was a failure as a combat officer in world wars. The number of defectives among the Negroes was much higher. The Negro is physically inferior. His normal physical activity is generally small due to his laziness. These were declassified documents. These were documents stamped official in the U.S. Army War Department. But the last thing I want to say is the legacy that they have left would make any black person proud, because you took somebody and you told them you can't do it. You can't do it. They did it.
I think the Red Ball Express did quite well on the ground, too.
My uncle drove for the Red Ball Express for 20 7 months. He was the one that went over, and I told you the MPs came and got him, and he wanted to know why they came to get him, and they said, you were drafted a month ago. He had some stories, and I could kick myself in the rear for not writing them down, but he had some stories. I mean, some stories. And he thought the world of General Patton. He hated Eisenhower and the other general with a passion. He said, if I see Eisenhower out there one day in a rut in a Jeep, he said, I'm going to run him over. He hated it. But they were, as you very well know, they drove 5-ton dump trucks, and they loaded them with ammo. And when they would deliver the ammo to a unit, some of the times the ammo was delivered to armored units, but most of the time it was delivered to infantry units. And when you would go out with the infantry unit that you were delivering the ammo to, you would have to put, you know how the lip on the back of a 5-ton dump truck goes up? Well, you put the back of the truck up, and as you pull a box of ammo off, the other ammo just slides right down into place. So that's what he did until the truck was empty. Once the truck was empty, if the fighting was fierce, he got his rifle out and got up underneath the truck and started fighting like everybody else. He said, the commanding officer came over to him one day and said, Ron, why do you fight like this? He said, hell, what else am I going to do? There ain't no bar around here.
Recently, I read that they had been studying some of Hitler's diaries, personal diaries, prior to World War II, prior to his political career. And he was a fan, as many were in Europe, of Western novels. And then he got interested in American Western history and the British conquest of North America. And he somewhat modeled his career on the treatment of the British in the Native Americans and the slave population, and he modeled his own career on our career in conquering North America. And he thought he could use this model to conquer the world. And we wound up using our failure model that roused such hope in people that even when they were mistreated, they fought for the dream of America.
Right. But the legacy that the Red Ball Express left, the Tuskegee Airmen left, the 471st Tank Division, the Triple Nickel All Black Airborne Division, the 333rd Artillery Division. There was nothing in that pointed to anyone as being a coward. There was nothing in that, because I've read their history. There was nothing in there that pointed to them being a coward. So when this Army War Department study showed up, and you can't engage an enemy in actual combat because of your lack of physical courage, somebody in there did not know what they were talking about, and they were promoting Jim Crow. But it didn't last. So look at the legacy that all these groups have left behind. My aunts, husbands, my dad's sister, my aunts, husbands, dad fought with Teddy Roosevelt on San Juan Hill. And they have a picture of it. They had a picture of it in the house, and I tried to find it before she passed away, but I couldn't. He was right beside Teddy Roosevelt on a horse and you could see him with his rifle. And you go back to the Buffalo Soldiers, the 9th and 10th Cavalry, and they were talking about, again, lack of courage. There was a Buffalo soldier who had gotten the Medal of Honor, and they were going to give him the second one, and they said, wait, hold it. Ain't you already got one? And they wouldn't give him his second Medal of Honor. So courage is a word in the dictionary when you're talking about soldiers, and courage knows no color. You drive a rat in the corner and you got a fight on your hands. That's what my dad used to tell me. Drive a rat in the corner. He said, you got to fight. Any other questions? If
You were mentioning that, of course, the Red Tail movie and some other documentaries that you're about. And as you view the military challenge, just randomly at different times, even present day, those that you just spoke of and all the distinctions that they had, and the bravery and the courage that they displayed, you never see any of these black units pictured.
right.
Anywhere. And so we were never, ever there.
Well, I was in high school, and I had mentioned in front of the history teacher that, well, back then, this is in the 60s, and I was saying, well, the colored pilots, and this lady, high school teacher, she said, stop. She said, colored pilots where? I said, in World War II. She said, who told you that tale? I said, well, my dad was part of the Tuskegee Experiment. And she said, well, what did they do? I said, they trained pilots and they sent them to Europe in World War II. She said, no such thing happened. She said, you go back and tell whoever told you that they told you a lie, because there were no colored pilots in World War II. Actually, there was a black pilot in World War I, Bullock. He was, either he was from France and ended up here, but he was a pilot in World War II. In 1936, before the war actually got started, Haile Selassie out of Ethiopia started his own Air Force. He had the money to do it. And he hired a black from Chicago by the name of John C. Robinson to start his Air Force. He trained it, and they said by the early 40s, it was considered one of the best air forces in the world. And he was from Chicago. He actually went to Ethiopia, and when he passed away, he was buried in Ethiopia. But his name was John C. Roberts. And he was trained, part of his training was at Tuskegee in the Civil Air Patrol. But you people can do it. I know you can, because I've seen it. Thank you
very much. Excuse me. If you'll stand here for a second, I appreciate it. Yes, that's fine. I want to thank you guys for coming out tonight, and this has been very enlightening. I'm sure that you, as well as I, have gotten quite a bit out of it, and the atmosphere has been quite great, and the information that was passed on to us has been phenomenal. The photographs has been extremely great and educational. Mr. Hargro was really enlightening to us all. I think that West Virginia State has a phenomenal history when it comes to the Tuskegee Airmen, and we can share that with those gentlemen and females who are in that program. I want to again invite you to the next program, the last Thursday of July. Mr. Sim Freisen will be here, pass the word on to your friends, your relatives, your neighbors, your church members, and I look forward to seeing you then. But I'd like to bring someone up, Miss Clarine Carter, one of my board members for the West Virginia Center for African American Art and Culture. She'd like to present a certificate of appreciation from our governor, Jim Justice, to Mr. Hargro for his participation in our program, the Block Speaker Series. Come forward, Ms. Glow. And if you would just read that certificate to Mr. Hargro.
Whereas Edward Hargro, Jr. is a resident of Morgantown, West Virginia, and therefore Edward Hargro, Jr. attended Bluefield State College and received a Bachelor of Science degree, physical education and biological, and also played the letter of football. And thereas Edward Hargro Jr. is the son of a Tuskegee Airman, biology at Triadelphia High School, was an assistant coach and a member of the Big Brothers Wheeling, West Virginia. And thereas Edward Hargro Jr. served and achieved the rank of lieutenant in the United States Army in the Officers Cadet School in 1967 and was later served 6 years in the West Virginia National Guard, attaining the rank of second lieutenant. And thereas Edward Hargro Jr. worked for Ayers Laboratories as a pharmaceutical salesman representative from February 1972 until March of 1982. Then is that Glaxo Smith Kline, beg your pardon? Glaxo, okay. Pardon, Smith Kline Pharmaceuticals from March 1982 until February 2008. And thereas Edward Hargro Jr. is a caring and loving person and dedicated to and committed to his family, friends, community, and career, has been an outstanding example for us. Now, therefore, I, Jim Justice, Governor of the great state of West Virginia, do hereby bestow upon Edward Jr. this certificate of recognition on, y'all have to excuse me, I had my eyes dilated today. Given under the hand of the great Governor of the state of West Virginia on June in the year of our Lord 2018, Jim Justice Governor, and I present this to you.
Thank you very much.
Sorry about my
Thank you all for coming tonight. I appreciate it. Thank you, Ms. Hargro.
The block is yeah. My house and your house, and up in the holler. We got preachers and teachers, yeah, got doctors and lawyers. I said my house and your house, and up in the holler. Musicians, yeah, we got hustlers and ballers. Back in the day, on the block, y'all. Here we go. People from all over, from all the places. They helped to build this great state, city and nation. There comes a time when we gotta say thanks to the block, yeah, back in the day. This is the time when we must say thanks to the block. I said now back in the day, to the people, places and things, to all the memories that the block did bring. Back in the block, in the day, yeah. Come on with me, y'all. Back in the day, to the block, yeah. I said back to the block, yeah. I want to tell you one more time. My house and your house, and up in the hollers. We got preachers and teachers, doctors and lawyers. I said my house, your house, and up in the holler. Musicians, yeah, they got hustlers and ballers. People from all over came and claimed their places. They helped to build this great state and city and nation. I said there comes a time when we gotta say thanks to the block, yeah. I said back in the day, back to the block, yeah. Get it to me. Back in the block, Ooh, yeah. I can remember all the good times I used to have. Going to church, to restaurants and shows. Ooh, when Wilson Pickett came to town, and James Brown came to town. Ooh, yeah, Mordecai Johnson, all the good preachers and teachers. That's right, I was there. Some of y'all were too.